It can't have been one tree. Because after they eat the one, God stops them from eating the other. So there were two separate trees. So this view can't be true either. Okay. The sixth view is the view I believe is correct. Okay? And this is the view that I'm going to focus on for the rest of this sermon. Okay? So this view says the problem was not with the tree or the fruit of the tree, but with the act of eating. And I think it aligns slightly to what Paula said. That the problem is not with the fruit, it is with the act of eating of it. Okay? When God says do not eat and you eat, that is what is wrong. What is wrong is the eating of that which God said you should not eat. That is what the problem is. Okay? And I believe this appears to be most correct for a few reasons which I'll go through now to show you why I believe that the problem with the tree of knowledge of good and evil is not inherent in the tree itself. It is in the act of doing the eating, which was contrary to what God had said. Okay? So it is the sin of disobedience, if you like. That God said do not do this, but you go and listen to the devil and you do it. That is what is wrong. The fruit itself, the fact that God puts in the garden this tree, from where this view says the fact that God puts this tree in the garden means that this tree can actually be eaten. Otherwise, God is a bad God. Why would he put poison in front of you and he makes it look very beautiful, good for food? Because it says when the woman looked at the food, it looked good and pleasant to the eye and good for food. If God was like that, it's like you telling your child, don't eat these sweets. And one of the sweets contains cocaine. And you tell them, don't eat these sweets. And you put it in front of the child so that they are tempted to eat it of it. And when they eat of it, they become addicted to cocaine. You can't be a good parent. And simply say, no, I was putting in this so that I can teach you a lesson. That can't be good. Okay? So the idea of this view is that it is in the disobedience, not in the tree itself, because the tree itself was good for food. It could be eaten. And we'll come to that just now. Okay? So the problem is that man is choosing to become autonomous, to decide for himself what is right and what is wrong, not what God says. Okay? Man is deciding he will do what he thinks is right, not what God says. We know Saul, for example. You know the story of Saul. Briefly, the story of Saul is that Saul goes into battle. And God instructs him that when you have defeated your enemies, I want you to destroy all the sheep and the cows and everything. Okay? And then they go and they win the battle. And Saul looks at the heads of cattle. Excuse me. He looks at the heads of cattle and all that was there. He decides, no, I'm not going to kill all these animals. This is wealth. Cattle is good. So he decides he's going to keep some of the cattle. So he comes back with the cattle. And when he comes back, the prophet hears the sound of cattle. And then he asks, what is that I hear about the cattle? And they say, no, we decided not to kill the cattle. And then he's told, but we told you to destroy the cattle. God said you must destroy the cattle. Why I bring? Then he has an excuse that, no, some of them will use to sacrifice and thank God for the victory. Now it sounds good, but you are directly going against what God said. And we know that it was because of that Saul loses his kingship. So for God, it was very serious that Saul decided to go against the instruction of God. Okay. I would like to turn to this passage in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 28. Now, this passage has always been used, for example, to refer to the devil, that this is when the devil was kicked out of heaven. But I think it is a misquotation. Okay? Somebody interpreted like this, and most people continue to view that way. But that is not the only view of this passage. There are some who believe that we're actually misinterpreting this passage when we read the devil into it. This is not about the devil. This is about the man in the Garden of Eden. Okay? Let's read it. Ezekiel 28. It says, Son of man. Okay? So obviously here, we're talking about Son of man. It's a human being that is talked about here. Son of man, say to the ruler of Tyre, that the ruler of Tyre is the king of Tyre. Okay? This is what the sovereign Lord says. In the pride of your heart you say, I am God. In the pride of your heart you say, I am God. Now we know when the devil says to the woman, God is jealous of you becoming like him. If you eat of this tree, you'll become like him. This is what begins to enter into the mind of the woman and the man. Because remember, the man is standing there next to her. In the pride of your heart you say, I am God. I sit on the throne of a God in the heart of the seas. Now we know that God said to the man, you shall rule over creation. Okay? So man begins to see himself, says, God has said, I rule over everything that is here. And if I touch of this tree, I become a God myself. I become like God and know everything there is to know. So this is what God is saying to the king of Tyre, who was thinking like the man in the garden. Okay? In the pride of your heart you say, I am God. I sit on the throne of a God in the heart of the seas. But you are a mere mortal and not a God. Okay? God says you forget that you are a mere mortal. You are made of the ground, of the earth. You still die. You don't have eternal life. And we know that before Adam and Eve saying they were mortal, they were not immortal. One of the ideas that we hear, and I think maybe I must make this clear. Okay? There are people who say, if Adam and Eve did not eat of this tree, we would live forever. No, we would not. We were created mortal. We will still die. The only thing that will stop man from dying is if he ate the tree of life. But from the point we were created, before we ate of the tree of life, we remained mortal. We did not have immortality. So it's important to understand that point. That before man ate of the fruit, he was not immortal. Okay? If man was immortal before he ate of the fruit, the immortality would not have disappeared. Which is why God actually stops him from eating the tree of life, so that he does not become immortal. Okay, so it's important to understand that. Okay, so God reminds this man, he says, you are a mere mortal and not a God, though you think you are as wise as a God. You think you know good and evil. You think you are like God, but you are a mere mortal. You were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. Okay? Now we know that God has created man and he said he is very good. Man is beautiful in the creation. Okay? And he says, you were in Eden, the garden of God. Okay? So this passage, although it is a parable, it refers to the person who was in the Garden of Eden. And I believe this is a parable about Adam and Eve. Although it was being used as a story about the king or ruler of Tyre. Then he continues, you were anointed as a guardian cherub. Okay? Now this is where most of Christianity has went wrong in believing that this passage is about the devil. Because the devil was an angel. That when it says you were anointed as a guardian cherub, it refers to the devil who was an angel in heaven. My view, and the views of those who hold the view I'm holding, is that the guardian cherub is an expression, like saying somebody is a watchdog. To say somebody is a watchdog is not to say that they are a dog. Okay? Tuli Madonzela is a watchdog, but she's not a dog. She's a human being. What she does is similar to what a watchdog does. Okay? So when we say, God says he anointed Adam as a guardian cherub, is to say God made Adam the guardian of the garden, like a cherub does in heaven. Okay? So the man in the garden was made to be the watchdog, to be the guardian or the shamar, to keep the garden safe. That's all it means. It is not to say he is a cherub, in the same way that to say somebody is a watchdog makes them a dog. Okay? So by being called a guardian cherub does not make Adam a cherub. It simply means that he carries out the similar role of what a cherub does as a guardian. Okay? For so I ordained you, it says. You were on the holy mount of God. You walked among the fiery stones. Now in the Bible, the holy mount of God is always about the earth, never about heaven. Okay? You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created. So when I created you, you were fine. You were blameless until wickedness was found in you. Until you began listening to the devil and wickedness came into you. So I drove you in disgrace from the mount of God. So the mount of God is an expression that refers to the garden. Okay? So I drove you in disgrace from the mount of God. And you'll know next time that God drove them out of the garden after they've done this. And I expelled you, guardian cherub. Okay? Now we know, as we'll see next time, that when Adam is expelled out of the garden as the guardian cherub, God sends another cherub to come and guard. Okay? Which shows you that the job that Adam was supposed to do in the garden was that of the guardian cherub. Now, after he's chased out, God sends a cherub from heaven to come and guard the garden and the tree of life. Okay? So I expelled you, guardian cherub, from among the fiery stones. Your heart became proud on account of your beauty, and you corrupted your wisdom because of your splendor. So I threw you to the earth. Okay? Now, what does it mean, I threw you to the earth? Okay? Some people have interpreted this to say, God threw the devil out of heaven to the earth. For me, as you'll see next time, I threw you to the earth simply means I push you back to the ground where you came from. Okay? You now die, you'll go back to the ground where you come from. That's the expression. You'll see it next time when we read that God said to the Adam, now that you've done this, you will die, you'll go back to the ground where you come from. That's all it means. And now you're going to till the earth with toil. But we'll talk about that next time. Okay? And I made you a spectacle of you before kings, because the passage is talking about a king. So this passage gives us a view of how God viewed the action of Adam and Eve in the garden. That they were supposed to be guardians of that garden. They then start thinking that they are gods and they do what is wrong, and God chases them out of the garden, and they lose that role of being the guardian of the garden. They lose it. Okay? So we have mentioned that the problem of this is that they eat of this fruit when God said they may not eat. And we said that is the problem, and that is the sin that they have. So the forbidden fruit is not about the fruit itself. It's about when it can be eaten. I've made a comment earlier that the fruit could be eaten. Okay? But it could be eaten only when God says they may eat of it. Okay? My personal view is that there was a time when God was going to come back to Adam and Eve and said, now you can eat of that tree. That tree was never meant never to be eaten by God. Or by man, sorry. God meant that man at some point will eat of the tree, and he will only eat of it when God says you may. But the problem was that man ate of it before God said so. Okay? So the fact that the tree is in the garden and that it looked good for food means that they could eat it at the right time. That's the point I'm making. Okay? And the same applies to the tree of life. It was also in the garden, and they could eat of it. But we know after they have eaten of this one, God says you can no longer eat the other one, because now it will be bad for you to eat the other one. Even though before they eat of this one, it was okay to eat the other one. Okay? So the problem with these trees is not that they cannot be eaten. Is that they cannot be eaten at the timing of man, but at the timing of God. Man will still have the chance to eat of the tree of life, but when God says so, not today. Okay? I believe the answer to this question of what the forbidden fruit was is lying in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 23 to 25. Okay? And maybe this is the passage, if you memorize anything about the forbidden fruit, this is what it's about. Read it with me. When you enter the promised land, now the promised land in the mind of the Hebrew was a land similar to the Garden of Eden. God was finally putting man in the Garden of Eden, the land that flows with milk and honey. Okay? So in the mind of the Jews and the Israelites, the land, the promised land of Eden, of Canaan, represented the promised land. So he says when they were leaving Egypt to go into the promised land, this is what Moses said to the people. When you enter the promised land and plant any kind of fruit tree, regard its fruit as forbidden. So when you arrive in the promised land and you plant an apple tree or a mango tree or an orange tree, regard those oranges and those apples as forbidden. You cannot eat of those fruit. For 3 years you are to consider those fruit forbidden. It must not be eaten. In the 4th year, all its fruit will be holy, an offering of praise to the Lord. But in the 5th year, you may eat its fruit. In this way, your harvest will be increased. What is the forbidden fruit? The forbidden fruit is this fruit that they plant in the land, that for 4 years they are not supposed to eat of it, because for 4 years it is forbidden. But in the fifth year, it is no longer forbidden. They can now eat of it. Now what does God say here? He says, in this way, if you eat it in the 5th year, your harvest will be increased. Now what happens in the garden when Adam and Eve eat of the fruit? The harvest is not increased, it is decreased. The penalty given to Adam is that now, because you have eaten of this fruit, you will struggle to get food out of the ground. The trees will no longer bear good harvest for you. So the consequences of eating the forbidden fruit leads to less fruit. And that is what Adam faces. And this is what I believe was going on in the Garden of Eden. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil was the forbidden fruit, in that they were not supposed to eat of it at that time. But God was going to tell them when they could eat of it. It could well be that this particular passage meant that for 4 years, Adam and Eve will not be allowed to eat of that particular tree. But after 5 years, they will be able to eat of it. Because this passage in Leviticus, to tell them about how they must treat their fruit when they arrive in Canaan, in the Palestine, my view is to remind them of what happened in the garden. That if you are willing to wait on God, remember earlier, speaking of life, said, be still and know that I am God. If Israel was going to arrive in the promised land and be still and know that he is God, after 5 years, they will be able to eat of the fruit of the gardens. And they will have even more fruit after that. But if they were going to go into the promised land and eat of the fruit before the 4 years were over, from then on, their trees will give them very little fruit. And this is what we find happening in the garden because of that. Now I want to conclude by showing you the similarity between what Adam does and what happens to Jesus when he is tempted by the devil. Okay? It says, when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food, 1, and 2, pleasing to the eye, and 3, desirable for gaining wisdom, she took the fruit and ate it. Now we find that that is exactly how the devil approaches Jesus when Jesus was being tempted in the wilderness. So I'm just comparing here between Genesis 3 and Matthew 4. Okay? In Genesis 3, the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food. Now the devil goes to Jesus in the wilderness after Jesus has been fasting for 40 days. And he says to him, you can make these stones into bread. And you know what? Jesus looked at those stones, and those stones could become bread. And he was very hungry. And there was nothing that could stop Jesus from being able to do that. Jesus could turn those stones into bread. But he decided not to turn them into bread. 2, it says it was pleasing to the eye. Okay? In the second temptation, the devil takes Jesus to the top of the temple and say, you can jump off here. You can do bungee jump. Yeah, you can do a bungee jumping off the roof of the temple, and you will not get hurt. Okay? Now, those who have done bungee jumping, it is a great experience. Okay? Now, Jesus could have wanted to do that, knowing that indeed the angel will be there at the bottom to catch him. But he decides not to do it. Okay? And thirdly, it says it was desirable for gaining wisdom, to become like God, if you like. But in Matthew 4, the devil shows Jesus all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And he says to Jesus, you will become the king of all these kingdoms if you bow down and worship me. Now, the temptation that you find Jesus facing with the devil are exactly the same kind of temptation that the devil throws at Adam and Eve. And John, in 1 John 2, verse 16, gives us, if you like, an anatomy of what temptation looks like. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, all temptations have one or all of these ingredients. They are either the lust of the flesh, your flesh lusts to do something. You want to take cocaine. You want to overindulge on alcohol. Okay? Your body wants to do that. That's the lust of the flesh. Or the lust of the eyes. Something looks attractive. It looks good to the eye. Okay? Or the pride of life. I am important. That is the nature of all temptations we face. And John says, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, they come not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever. Okay? The victory of Jesus was in that Jesus on that mountain in the wilderness, when he was with the devil, was that because he knew that he could do all those things, he did not feel that he needed to prove it to the devil. And that is what the victory over the devil came from for Jesus. Jesus, according to Paul, in Philippians 2, verse 6 and 7, who existing in the form of God, okay? Jesus was God, as we read in John. Although he was God, did not consider being equal with God something to be grasped. Okay? So when Jesus was walking on the earth, he didn't use his godly privileges. So when he became hungry, for example, instead of turning any stone or anything around him into food and eat it, he waited for people to cook. Okay? For example, I will come home from playing when I was still a small boy, and I get home and my mom is only starting to eat, and I was hoping that she will have finished cooking and I will eat when I get home. Okay? Now Jesus, I'm sure there are times when he will arrive at a house and he's hungry and they haven't started cooking yet. Now being Jesus, he could find anything in the house. He could go out of the house and pick up a stone and make into bread and eat of it if he wanted to do that. But Jesus decided not to use those privileges. He decided to continue to be man and not to see godliness as something to grasp towards. And we find in the garden, that's what Adam and Eve does. They grasp at godliness. They grasp at being God. Because the devil tells them, you will become like God if you do this. And therefore they eat because they want to become God. And Jesus says, no, I'm not going to follow your instruction, the devil, because I want to become God. I won't do that. Because Jesus knew he was already in the image of God. He was already God. And mankind was supposed to remember that. That mankind was created in the image of God. Mankind was already like God. And therefore they did not eat the fruit to become like God. They were in the image of God, in the likeness of God. But the devil told them they are not like God. They could only become like God if they eat of it. And the devil was saying the same to Jesus. You are not really the Son of God unless you jump off and we see the angels catching you. Unless you turn these stones to bread, you are not really the Son of God. But Jesus knew, I am the Son of God. I don't need the affirmation of the devil to be the Son of God. And that's what you need to remember. That you don't need to be reminded by anybody or the devil that you are made in the image of God, that God loves you. He does. And you don't need to do anything to prove that. Because when we want to prove that, that's when we go wrong. Okay? So let's conclude. So the sin of Adam, as we saw, was eating when God said, do not eat, and eating the fruit whose time was not yet. That's what the forbidden fruit was about. It was about Adam and Eve eating before the time was right, and when God said, do not eat. Human impulsivity is the root of our sin, is the root of our problem. Okay? You know the story of Esau who sold his birthright because he could not wait to prepare some lunch for himself. And he decided to sell it for a bowl of soup. Now many today continue to do what Adam and Eve did, what Esau did, by not allowing themselves to wait for the timing of God. Many young people destroy their lives because they think they can, before they are mature enough to be able to handle alcohol, they start drinking. And before they know, by the time they turn 18, when legally they can start drinking, they no longer have control over alcohol. And therefore, by the time they're 18, it is no longer a choice they make, it is an addiction that controls them. Whereas if they waited until they are mature enough to be able to handle it. Alcohol is not a problem for them. Okay? The same with sexuality. There are many young people who go into problems because they think they cannot wait until they are married. And that impulsiveness is what leads them into serious problems in their lives. And so human impulsivity, which is what actually caused the downfall of Adam and Eve, is what continues to cause the downfall of man today. And the same happened to the life of David, the life of Solomon, the life of Judas. All the people in the scripture we find doing wrong, and all the people that we know who have done wrong, you can trace their problem to the fact that they are not willing to wait for the timing of God. What God says is forbidden today, but it will be okay tomorrow. They want to have it today. That is the problem for man. So you must realize that it is a demonic idea to say, I am the Son of God. Therefore, I need that, or I should not suffer this or that. Jesus, being God, allowed himself to suffer pain, allowed himself to be hungry, and not simply call on God to provide food on demand. That's not what godliness is about. Okay? So that's the point I wanted to make, that today you can clarify this idea of what indeed was this forbidden fruit. What is the seriousness of this sin? What was the sin Adam and Eve committed? And what does it mean for us today? How do we avoid the mistake they made? And next time, we're then going to focus on what are the consequences of doing this. And we'll find those consequences even in lives today that people are continuing to make. So we'll talk again next time on the consequences of this sin.